Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. Firstly, a big thank you to all of those people that have emailed the show. Some people have just emailed to say thank you. So that's really nice to hear. And then I've had quite a few requests of people that you would like to hear me interview. I will do my best. It's basically a case of being able to find the free time in both my own calendar, but also the busy calendars of the academics to see if they can give up 30 or 40 minutes of their time. But if you do have someone you would like me to talk to, then please do send an email. That is to thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com. And so my guest for this show was Dr. Sam Friedman from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Sam is best known for his work on the issue of class and inequality. I decided to talk to Sam about his new book, The Class Ceiling, Why It Pays to Be Privileged, written with Daniel Lorison. And this takes a real insight into a range of different factors to do with social class. In particular, the idea of social mobility, how easy it is to be able to move up the social class ladder, and in fact how difficult it is within certain professions. I also asked Sam about the issue of meritocracy as well, and whether he thinks that that is actually a thing or a little bit of a myth. Another really enjoyable chat, and so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thanks for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Sam Friedman, and I'm an associate professor in sociology at the London School of Economics.
Thank you, Sam. And what's your history in sociology, Sam? Did you study it yourself at A-level, want a degree? What's your background?
Yeah, I've got a long history with sociology. Sociology weirdly was a real eureka moment for me. When I was a teenager, I had gone to this private school in Bristol between 11 to 16. Really didn't enjoy myself there. I think my sort of discomfort with a lot of the inequalities that I saw being obscured through this system were a really sort of important formational element of my schooling. And I left to go to a sixth form college just outside Bristol and studied sociology for the first time at A-level. And it really sort of gave me a lexicon, a set of orientating concepts to try and actually work through, aspects of my own biography and privilege, as well as some of the experiences I'd seen with some of my friends, particularly friends from working class backgrounds at the private school who had been, had found the experience particularly difficult. So I studied sociology at A-level, and then I went on and studied sociology and politics for undergrad at Edinburgh University, and then again at masters at the LSE actually, and then back to Edinburgh for a PhD. So I'm very much sort of sociology from teenage years upwards. It's a very core part, I think, of who I am.
Right. And you mentioned social class there. Anyone that knows your work will know that that's your kind of key area of focus. So when you were studying yourself, was it Marxism that first kind of grabbed you? Or was there a particular theory or sociologist?
No, I think actually it was, I'd been brought up, I suppose, in a kind of champagne socialist left-wing upbringing. And so I had been kind of introduced to some extent to the ideas of Marx. But I think it was actually the ideas of Pierre Bourdieu in my A-levels that really was this kind of, I suppose, eureka moment. And, there's a couple of things there. I think it was particularly about helping me to understand, I suppose, aspects of my own experience in the education system alongside that of particularly a key friend of mine, a guy who had been my kind of best friend at school, but had come from a very different class background to mine. And, we had been perhaps slightly disruptive teenagers at school, but it was really interesting the different ways that the school read our potential and our sort of academic capacity and potential contributions to the school. And, understanding particularly Bourdieu's idea of cultural capital, and the ways in which perhaps the dispositions that I had helped me to manage and negotiate that interaction with this middle class institution, the school that I was at, and how that had ultimately allowed me to have a much more seamless adolescent transition, even when, a lot of the same disruptive behaviour I was exhibiting the same as my friend.
So you used your cultural capital to your advantage, yeah? The right accent, the right dress, and
absolutely. And I think it always was a kind of really interesting sense for me. During this adolescent period, my friend actually moved to my area of Bristol, a kind of affluent middle class part of Bristol. And what was really interesting was not just in the context of schooling, but this sense of how his family wasn't really able to fit and wasn't made to feel comfortable in this area. They had different tastes, they looked different, they dressed differently, they spoke differently, and they were sort of classically upwardly socially mobile from working class Welsh backgrounds. And I think for me, there was just this kind of enduring fascination with why there seemed to be elements of who I was that was, I could see, giving me a sort of unfair advantage in lots of meaningful areas of life and causing difficulties for people that, I had got a real emotional connection to, perhaps, because of the fact that, this was a sort of very open part of life when you're perhaps more able to make connections across social difference. But so I suppose these were really formational experiences, and as I said at the beginning, and as I often say to students, I think that's often what really gets students into sociology, and perhaps sometimes or perhaps the traditional narrative is actually that it's people from working class backgrounds or backgrounds that have faced various kinds of discrimination or inequality that find sociology in its home. But I think for me, it was actually the opposite experience. It was trying to make sense of privilege and advantage, and why that was.
Perhaps a sensitive question, Sam, you don't have to answer it. Did you feel any element of guilt there, in comparison to your kind of friends and upbringing there?
Yeah, I think it's, guilt's perhaps a strong word to put on it. I think it was a sort of confusion, and perhaps a sort of suspicion about why things were happening to me and not to others. And I think, there's a sort of sense in which I was at an age where I was really keen to really understand what those processes were and how I could name them and speak about them, and analyze them, I suppose. And I think sociology allowed me to do that. But I think it's kind of what it's kept in terms of what it's kind of inculcated is an enduring interest with understanding elements of kind of privilege and advantage in class terms.
Yeah, and that's obviously influenced, well, the main work that I'd like to talk with you today, your book, The Class Ceiling, why it pays to be privileged. So I guess your background influenced your interest in wanting to do that study in the first place.
Yeah, interestingly, the precursor to that study was actually some work that I did looking at people who had experienced very extreme long-range upward social mobility. And the angle that my initial focus came at that subject was really the kind of emotional experience of that very extreme sort of social movement, and the ways in which it often left kind of hidden injuries in the kind of psyche and identities of people who had experienced that trajectory, even when as a society we often hold them up as the kind of winners of meritocracy. And I suppose there was lots of aspects that came out of that, but one of the things that I wondered was, as well as a kind of emotional imprint, what does that sort of discomfort when you are moving into a realm, a milieu, occupationally, that is very alien to you in relation to the way you've been brought up, how might that structure outcomes that you have in the labour market in a more sort of substantive sense? And so what we began doing, this is with a colleague, Daniel Lorison, was to really look at what do the kind of top professions look like in the UK? What's the makeup of those professions in terms of people's backgrounds? And, what you could see there, which was, perhaps not surprising, but interesting to really put empirical weight behind some of the presumptions we might have, is that most of those professions, medicine, law, academia, are incredibly exclusive in terms of who gets in. But we also wanted to take things a step further. The policy narrative around social mobility in the UK has traditionally had a strong interest in trying to increase access to both university but also the professions. But the question that, as I said, my initial work on the experience of social mobility had kind of had brought up was, well, once you get into law, once you get into engineering and architecture, clearly your background and the dispositions that it's given you don't just kind of ebb away. And so we wanted to look at who gets on as well as who gets in. And I think that was where we made perhaps the most original contribution, which was to kind of show that there is this powerful and previously unrecognised class pay gap in the UK.
Yeah.
So those from working class backgrounds earn on average 16% less than their more privileged colleagues in the same set of occupations. And interestingly, that class pay gap isn't explained away by what we might think of as kind of traditional markers of merit, educational attainment, how much training you have, how long you've been in your job. A significant and substantial pay gap remains even when we did this kind of what's called regression analysis to try and understand the drivers of that pay gap.
Yeah. You mentioned a few occupations there. I was just intrigued to know which occupations were the most elitist, which were the most kind of closed shop.
Yeah. So, unsurprisingly, I think medicine is the most exclusive profession in the UK. Only 6% of our doctors in this country come from working class backgrounds, which I think is slightly shocking when you think that about 33% of the population come from working class backgrounds. And I think, that there's a specific reason for that, which is, I think, an interesting one for some of your listeners who are doing their A-levels or even their GCSEs, which is that, most people who go into medicine have to make decisions about what subjects they do with an eye towards becoming a doctor aged, 14, 15. Who believes at that age they have the ability to enter the most prestigious and competitive occupation in the country? Well, if you've come from a background where you have been sort of inculcated with that sense of self-belief, and interestingly, what we found was that there are very strong rates of what's called micro-class reproduction. So that's when you follow directly in the footsteps of a parent doing an occupation. So quite incredibly, if you have a doctor who is a parent, you're 24 times more likely to be a doctor yourself than anyone else in the population.
I think you said similar for law, is it? Is it law?
Yeah, I think it's 16 times for law, and film and television also striking on that kind of micro class reproduction. So, you know, places, what we found, I suppose, is that some of the traditional professions, so medicine, law, journalism, the media, are really where you see this kind of particular exclusivity in terms of who gets in. And then when it turns to who gets on, you know, it's an interesting picture. And what we did in the book was actually move from a kind of large-scale quantitative data based on the ONS labour force survey to try and dig more qualitatively into what might be driving this class pay gap. And to do that, we went into a number of elite firms in different occupations. So we spoke to a large multinational accountancy firm. We spoke to an architecture practice, and we also went into one of Britain's biggest television broadcasters, which I can tell you who that was because they de-anonymised.
I know, yeah.
So that was Channel 4. The other ones were anonymised, but Channel 4, interestingly, kind of bravely outed themselves, and I say brave because as you will see if you have a chance to have a look at the book, it's an incredibly elite place, Channel 4, despite perhaps its own rhetoric and marketing. You know, we found that when you get to the top echelons, in particular of Channel 4, only 2 or 3% of the kind of senior management and senior commissioners are from working class backgrounds. So, you know, what we were kind of saying in the book is that this pay gap is not so much about people necessarily doing the same work for different amounts of pay, which we know is an issue in relation to gender. And it's more about this idea of a class ceiling. So people who gets right to the top and therefore earns the highest salaries. And so the book really tries to dig into what's driving that class ceiling effect. And, you know, and tries to sort of, each chapter in the book kind of pulls out a significant mechanism that perhaps explains why, even when people from working class backgrounds are just as good in every kind of meritocratic way we can measure, they don't tend to get to the top.
How much of it is, you know, what Bourdieu might call social capital, who, you know, old boys network? How much of that does influence your success, both getting the job and getting on?
Yeah, so this was a really key part of what we were finding, although perhaps slightly different to the popular narrative here. So I think when we tend to think about social capital, we tend to think about this kind of slightly fleeting idea of who's a good networker, these kind of weak tie connections, if you will. What we were finding in the book is actually when you talk to people who have got to the very top in Britain, the stories of career progression are very often structured around the influence of maybe 2 or 3 key individuals who, you know, we argue in the book, act as basically sponsors, not mentors, but sponsors, people who often operating beneath the formal mechanisms of a business or an organization, fast track their careers. They advocate for them in key settings, and other sorts of sort of behavior that helps to propel their careers forward. And the interesting part of that in relation to class is that although, you know, on the surface of it, people very often talk about those sponsorship relationships being based on talent spotting, what was interesting was to look at what's the ingredient that transforms an everyday working relationship into a bond worthy of sponsorship. Well, actually, in the interviews, it was very clearly not a kind of work connection. You know, it was very often a kind of much more informal, cultural point of contact, you know, sharing taste, sharing hobbies, sharing humor.
Yeah.
And that's where, you know, we argue those sponsorship relationships tend to reproduce sort of class hierarchies, i.e. people are recruiting and sponsoring in their own image, and that acts to perpetuate this class ceiling effect. So connection's very important, but I suppose we also felt that, economic capital actually also plays a really key role here as well. You tend to think again that economic capital is perhaps really useful for your early part of your life, maybe help you get a foot in the door, help you pay for an internship. But interestingly, in a lot of these professions, particularly the culture and creative industries, television, we also look to actors, the bank of mum and dad, the insulation that provides is really crucial in structuring not just the start of your career, but often middle and even beyond, because it allows you the freedom often to make risky decisions, to do things that might have a long-term benefit for your career. For a lot of actors, take a play to the Edinburgh Festival. For the television people, do that sort of risky project with that director that might pay off with an award nomination that then gets you a big contract. Whereas often people from working class backgrounds were saying, the economic reality of day-to-day life is a kind of chaos, and therefore often their decision making was very different and was much more orientated around survival, which wasn't necessarily beneficial for their careers. Maybe that's taking an advert if you're an actor that doesn't necessarily do much for your career. Or in television, actually, you often got this kind of effect where people would sort out of the most prestigious creative route and they'd move more towards sort of allied parts of television. So marketing, sales, admin, which wasn't where they wanted to go, but where they felt there was more economic security.
Yeah, I guess there's that element of being able to take a risk, isn't there? That if you've got a support network, if you've got a safety net, if you like, you can take that risk that perhaps the working classes can't. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, it's very hard to kind of quantify exactly what that counterfactual world looks like, where people are able to take those risks. But I think it was really key in the stories of people from privileged backgrounds, when you dug into the decisions they'd made and you asked them the kind of bare bones economics questions. So, when you were doing that project that propelled your career, how did you actually survive? That's often where you saw this sort of insulating effect of the bank of mum and dad. They helped me with my rent at that point, and etc. And we don't talk about these things, That's the interesting thing. They're kind of hidden from view because they're often quite sensitive. But they're really crucial, I think, in understanding why sort of meritocracy is very hard to realize, because parents will often, in the name of love, help their children in whatever the way they can. When they have significant resources, that will come, and you particularly see that in relation to who can come and make a life in this city, in London, where most of the opportunities in this country are clustered, right? And cost of living is very, very high. And so, we very often, we're hearing stories of, parental economic capital structuring people's ability to move to the capital to take up lucrative or prestigious job opportunities.
Great. Thank you, Sam. That's going to be the end of part one. You just mentioned the word meritocracy. In part two, I'd like to ask you a little bit more of that. Okay, welcome back to part two. I'm talking to Sam Friedman about his book, The Class Ceiling, Why It Pays to Be Privileged. Sam, you mentioned the term meritocracy. Is meritocracy a myth? Does it exist?
I think it is a myth. I think that it's incredibly firmly embedded in our psyche, really, in this country and throughout the West, really. And I think people. What a lot of the survey data shows is that people feel and believe very strongly in it. It's a kind of orientating concept for how people live their lives. And I think, there's perhaps not so much of a problem in aspiring to certain aspects of meritocracy and notions of fairness in certain workplace settings. But I think what I feel really strongly about is that we are much more realistic as a society about how things work at present. And so we're in a position to be, I think, more critical about the state of our meritocracy, if you will. I think that's really important, particularly for those that currently are the sort of losers of meritocracy, and who, I think, as a result of a system that sort of perpetuates this myth, tend to inevitably blame themselves for not achieving in the way that they might, or that others do. And I suppose that's what I see the book as really trying to sort of forensically uncover, the ways in which the sort of stories of success that people like to feel about themselves are structured in various ways by forms of advantage or disadvantage that are really important to understand.
And I possibly should have asked you this earlier, nearer towards the beginning then. So how would you measure social mobility? What would you measure as someone that's perhaps moved from working class to middle class, for example?
Yeah, so this is a key question, and actually, not fully undisputed. But I suppose the traditional way in sociology, and actually also in policy terms, I'm a commissioner at the UK Government Social Mobility Commission, and this is also how we define social mobility in the Commission, which is to look at the sort of class, position, or destination of your parents. So that's often, you might look at that in terms of income if you're an economist, but as a sociologist, we tend to look at occupation. And then you see, you sort of organize people's occupations into a kind of a set of groupings. And in the UK, we have something that was developed by John Goldthorpe called the National Statistics Socioeconomic Classification. And those map onto, I think, everyday concepts that we tend to use, like working class and middle class. So specifically in this study, we were interested in people whose parents, when they were growing up, did working class, manual, semi-manual work, anything from factory work to cleaners, to some sort of skilled manual type work, electricians, etc., who had made it into what we were calling in the book elite occupations. And that's the sort of top class of the socioeconomic classification. That's higher professional and managerial occupations. So that's that kind of movement. But of course, the movement can also be downward, which you don't hear much about in the policy world, but actually is really important if you want to have a open society, if you want to have fluidity, which is a phrase a lot of sociologists would use. You need to have just as much downward movement as upward movement. But of course, that's not something that's very popular for politicians to mention.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can put a percentage on it. What sort of percentage are we talking about of people that do make it, if you like, that are actively socially mobile from one class to another?
Yeah, so it sort of depends on which type of journeys you're doing. But in terms of that key journey that I just mentioned there, I can put a very definite figure on it because it's in the book. 10% of those from working class backgrounds will make it into elite occupations in the UK.
Yeah.
Whereas about 50% of those from those backgrounds, professional and managerial backgrounds, will end up in those jobs. So you see there's very distinct sort of pathways in the UK that map on from your origin to your destination. We actually use a kind of a map in the book to show that, which I think in some ways is an easier way to visualize this, if you will.
Yeah. And is that then used to sell the dream to others, if you like? The fact that some people can make it is then used to sell the dream to others that you can do it too?
Yeah, I think so. I think I think the tough thing about it, there's a couple of things that are really difficult about the sort of social mobility discourse. And, I have lots of colleagues who are rightly very critical of the whole idea of social mobility at a political level. And I think you even saw this coming out from the Labour Party itself during kind of Corbyn's tenure, is that, by fetishizing the top, you inadvertently suggest that there's something wrong with being in a working class occupation or from a working class background, that it's something to escape from, rather than necessarily seeing not only the value inherently of those cultures and of those forms of work, which, I think is particularly interesting in the context of where we are at the moment with coronavirus and a huge amount of working class jobs, key work being kind of reevaluated in really interesting ways, and saying, actually, what we should be thinking about is not how do you get people out of key work because that works, things we don't value enough, but perhaps we should be raising the value and salaries and job conditions of working class labour in the first place. So that's, I think, one really key sort of critique. I think the other one, which is probably more central to what the book's doing, is that obviously meritocracy sells, as you say, this idea that all you need to do in order to get to the top is to be talented, able, and work hard. And I think what we were trying to do in the book is say, well, that is demonstrably not the case, because even when these people do make it into these occupations and we can see are meritocratically exactly the same as their colleagues from more privileged backgrounds, they don't have the same outcomes. They don't do as well. And that, also I think sort of punctures the celebratory air of meritocratic discourse.
And does that become even more enhanced when you put gender and ethnicity into it as well? I know there's parts of the book that look at those factors as well as class.
Yeah, I think this is really important, actually, and was a key part of the book, really, which is this idea that actually, we need to sort of take an intersectional lens towards our understanding of social mobility, and that, people's identities are made up of cross-cutting characteristics that are absolutely key to understanding who they are and the experiences they have. And what you see in our data is that if you are from a working class background and you're a woman, or from many, not all, but many black and minority ethnic backgrounds, you face a very clear double disadvantage in terms of pay and progression. And, I think you only have to think about some of the cultural tropes we have around upward mobility to kind of understand that double disadvantage. So just on gender for a second, you think about how we sort of romanticize upward social mobility. We have this kind of idea of the plucky working class boy done good, the kind of David Beckham, Alan Sugar type figure, where we're much more kind of accepting, I suppose, of the working class identities that those people bring with them upwards. Whereas, you often, the stereotypes that surround women who try to sort of become upwardly mobile are much more stigmatizing, sort of the idea of the kind of social climber, this sort of pushy figure. And I think, that's, I think, key to understanding perhaps what we were finding in the qualitative work, which is that particularly the cultural dimensions of what goes on in occupations, what we call in the book the behavioral codes that are very classed about how you should dress and speak and present oneself in the workplace, often I think have a kind of clear gendered dimension. There is a sort of, what a lot of women from working class backgrounds were telling us was that they felt there was a kind of extra scrutiny on things like dress and on their working classness, in terms of accent and other kind of embodied dimensions that perhaps help us to unravel this double disadvantage in terms of pay.
Yeah, perhaps a difficult question. Do you offer any solutions, Sam? How do we destroy this class distinction, boundary, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, well, I mean, we do actually. We came up with 10 ideas. I mean, a lot of them are geared towards how organisations, the sorts of organisations that we worked with in the book, how they can start to think about this. And, some of that's about actually taking this stuff seriously at an organisational level. Part of the problem in the UK is that class origin is not a protected characteristic and traditionally hasn't been thought about in the same way as other characteristics in a kind of diversity agenda. And that's starting to change, and I think that's a good thing. So we're kind of pushing organisations to routinely measure and monitor the backgrounds of their staff, to interrogate whether they too have a class ceiling. I think also, one of the things that we really want to try and get organisations, and this could be schools and universities as well as businesses, but to think about what we call the kind of misrecognition of merit. So, what does talent really look like? What we were finding in organisations is that very frequently what those at the top are rewarding in terms of what talent looks like is actually quite strongly contested by most of the people within their organisation. Classic example of at Channel 4, highly prized was people's ability to kind of deploy highbrow forms of cultural knowledge in discussions about television. Now, what lots of people would say to us in interviews, anonymous interviews, is, why are we talking about the great American novel when we're making a program about lie detectors? Yeah. This knowledge is not actually relevant. And yet those in positions of power value it very strongly and are rewarding people on the basis of whether they have it or not. And so I think one of the things we're kind of calling for is for people to have a much franker discussion within their organizational settings about what talent, what capacities people really need to do the work in those organizations well, and to perhaps through that dialogue try and strip out some of the bases of that make up these kind of unhelpful and classed behavioural codes that are very powerful at the moment.
Right, thank you. People have to read the book to find out more, I guess. and if they do, Sam, could you just tell us where people can read your work, or where else can we learn more about you?
Yeah, so the book is available. It's cheap now on the Policy Press website. I think it's only $7.99. Most of my work is also downloadable from my LSE webpage, and I am fairly active on Twitter, and you can follow me there at Sam Friedman Sock.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. Really appreciate you giving up your time today, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Cheers, Sam. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com.